So I generally talk, I've given a lot of talks about Morton plant, and most of the time it's to local historical societies. So some of what is in this presentation is pretty narrowly focused. And I know you probably are much more interested in Connecticut as a whole. So I'm going to try to broaden out my talk about Plant and his significance to Connecticut in general. Appropriately enough, when I came in, I saw this banner here about the Progressive Era. And even though Plant himself was not particularly a progressive person, this is the era that I'm going to be talking about in terms of Plant, from 1900, or rather 1899, which was when Morton's father died, and 1918, which is when Morton died in the flu epidemic. That was when he really had his most significant contributions. Before that time, he really was in the shadow of his father. So let me begin. So some of what I have on this presentation, I'll probably jump over pretty quickly because I also want to keep on time. All right, so he traded his New York City townhouse to famed jeweler Cartier for a $1 million string of pearls that had caught his wife's eye. He cemented the success of a new women's college in New London with a $1 million donation that allowed him to end a Board of Trustees meeting and go watch his baseball team play. After his son was injured in an automobile accident and he couldn't find suitable local health care, he pledged enough money to make possible the establishment of the Clearwater, Florida hospital that still bears his name. In 1908, he spent the equivalent of more than $24 million in today's dollars to build a yacht upon which he would spend 9 months. It required a crew of skilled and non-skilled workers who would see the global sights that few members of the American working class of that era got to see. And it earned some of them 10 times the average annual salary of that day. Morton Plant enjoyed the wealth that was largely amassed and earned by his father. He played hard, he spent lavishly, and he also gave back to the community in ways that long endeared him to both the locals in his hometowns of Branford, Groton, New London, and New York City, and Clearwater, Florida, and still have an impact a century past his death. Some of the most broad ways that he impacted the state, he was frequently referred to in the papers of his time as Connecticut's wealthiest man. I have no idea whether that was accurate or not, because I didn't really have the ability to thoroughly research that. But that was oft repeated, and so he had a lot of significance in the areas of agriculture, recreation, transportation, including building roads and a trolley line that opened up transportation to the middle and working class, and conservation efforts and education. So he was born in 1852, and this is just a little snapshot of what life was like in the United States at that time. It seems very, very crude by today's standards. In 1868, this was when he was only 16 years old, and he started his professional life. He went to work for his father, Henry Bradley Plant, both Henry and Morton were both born in Branford. Morton went to work in a company called the Southern Express that was owned by his father. This was in Tennessee, and it was 3 years after the end of the Civil War. The Civil War had devastated the South, and it was still pretty ripped up at that time. The Southern Express was like a FedEx of the day. And at this time, Plant's hometown of Branford was becoming a popular summer resort. So he had grown up as a child. He spent actually very little time with his parents. His mother was a Blackstone, who, if some of you might know Branford history, and that is a big family name in Branford as well as Plant. She was from Branford as well, but she was very sickly, and his father was consumed with business. And so Morton grew up largely with his two sets of grandparents in New Haven and Branford. He did not attend college. He went to high school at Russell's Military Academy, which is no longer around, but that was in New Haven. And he had a fondness all his life for that area. In 1899, as I mentioned, Henry Bradley Plant, who was the person who amassed the Plant family fortune through establishing railroads and steamship lines, and largely by buying up failed railroads throughout the South and making them viable again. He and Henry Flagler were instrumental in opening up the state of Florida to people and transportation via building transportation routes, railroad routes. Flagler down the east coast of Florida, Plant to the Gulf Coast and Tampa Bay area. But Henry did not have much faith in his son Morton. Morton was his only child, and he made a lot of public pronouncements about Morton's abilities, or rather inabilities, he thought. And he actually, in his will, when he realized he was dying, he came back to Connecticut to have his will rewritten so that his grandson would inherit all of his fortune. His grandson at the time was only an infant. And basically cut out both his widow and Morton Plant of the fortune. His widow and Morton fought this and successfully overturned the will. So Morton's base was primarily in New York City. He did have this townhouse at 52nd Street and 5th Avenue, which is now the headquarters of Cartier. He did trade that later. But he grew up at a time, he lived there at a time when there was great disparities. There was a great immigrant population coming in, and so he saw great poverty. He saw the disease. He wasn't particularly, there wasn't much evidence that he was particularly moved in the sense of getting involved in settlement houses or children's causes or anything like that. But he did know about it, and he certainly understood it. In his neighborhood, in Midtown Manhattan, it was more like this. It was much cleaner. It was not so crowded, much more genteel, big houses. And his neighbors were some of the most well-known names of the Gilded Age, the Astors and the Vanderbilts, and those types of people. So his first love was on the water. He was a yachtsman from basically age 13 when he got his first boat. He knew of the Connecticut shoreline, obviously, and he first discovered southeastern Connecticut, where he would have his greatest influence and stay via boat. He sailed from New York area. He was a member of the New York Yacht Club and the Larchmont Yacht Club, and he sailed regularly back and forth up and down the Sound and up to Maine and out to Newport. And he saw southeastern Connecticut and was really lured in by what he saw there. Southeastern Connecticut at that time, this is New London around 1900, and New London was growing at the time, but was southeastern Connecticut was still pretty isolated. Remember, there wasn't really highways, there wasn't really roads at all. And that's one thing that plant paid for a lot, was to make roads into southeastern Connecticut. So he saw this as a place where he could have a lot of influence. And a lot of his early influence after his father died was really in the sense of being able to offer jobs and career opportunities of the type that people would not have otherwise found in southeastern Connecticut, working aboard some of his boats. And for example, he was a big supporter of the Yale-Harvard Regatta, and he would take people out on the water. And recreational boating was a huge economic driver along the shoreline, much more so than it is today. And this was one of his boats, actually the biggest one on the right there. That's a plant boat. I think it's the Venetia. But he hosted the Yale team a lot, and he actually did buy them what is today the property where they today have their boathouse in Gales Ferry, and they still row out of there for the regatta. This is New York Yacht Club in New London, which Plant was a member of. This is Plant's most famous boat, the most ostentatious yacht, and it was called the Yolanda. In October of 1909, he left New London on a 9-month trip, and it was this on board the Yolanda. It took him across the Atlantic to Europe, down the coast, and eventually through the Suez Canal. He went to the Middle East, he went to India, he went to China, and so he had this crew of people aboard, of a couple of hundred people who were working there, and they got to see these amazing sights. It was the third largest steam yacht at the time, and the second largest privately owned yacht at the time. It carried 400 tons of coal, and it cost $1 million to build. He had it built in Leith, Scotland, which is actually the same place where the Royal Yacht Britannia was built and is actually now berthed. It would be equal to about $24 million today. Although Plant generally was fairly private, he loved sort of showing off this big ostentatious yacht, and he celebrated its launch by hosting a luncheon in one of its smokestacks in 1908. And he did another publicity stunt where he rode a 6-cylinder automobile through one of the smokestacks, turned on end when it was still under construction. It was said that 520 people could shelter on this boat, and it cost $1,000 a day to operate, which in today's dollars would be $25,000. The crew began work at 5 a.m. and worked 12-hour shifts. And there was a lot of rules for people who worked aboard. But again, also they got to see places that no one else could see. This is another view of the Yolanda. Because at each port of call, half of them could get off and enjoy the sights. I'm going to skip over some of these. This is another Plant boat, the Ingomar, which has a really interesting story. And yachting and the yachtsmen of that time were really popular. There was a lot of news in the press about yachting, and probably because it was so steeped in so much money. One of those people was Plant. Beyond boating, though, Plant did a lot of both investment in and actually owning and establishing companies in many areas of transportation. He was really interested in the emerging technology of his time, a lot of which did revolve around transportation and new modes of transportation, and also building infrastructure for that transportation. He paid to have miles of roads paved in southeastern Connecticut and in East Lyme and New London and Groton. Some of it was in order to lure automobile drivers to his resorts, his summer resort down in Groton. But just in general, he thought this was important. And he built a trolley line which went from New Haven east to the westerly Rhode Island beaches. And then there was a line, part of it that went from New London north and went all the way up to Willimantic and Coventry, Connecticut. And so the trolleys were for the owners of the companies. Most of them did not make much money on these, and indeed Plant actually always ran his Shoreline trolley at a loss. But for the population of the time, they were a tremendous ability to open up areas that people didn't have access to in the past. Now, for a fairly modest fee, they could ride a trolley down to the shoreline, they could take a job in a neighboring town, in another factory, someplace else. So it allowed people to get around in a way that the railroads hadn't, and certainly horse and buggies and anything else hadn't up until that time. He also was an instrumental investor in the New York City subway system, and he was a heavy investor in the Cape Cod Canal, and he also invested in the Wright Brothers aerospace company. So he had a real interest in emerging transportation technologies. He also had learned from his father that a good way to fuel business on your transportation networks was to establish luxury resort hotels at different stops. And this was a hotel that his father built in Tampa. It's called the Tampa Bay Hotel. And it is now owned by the University of Tampa, and it's quite immense and pretty spectacular place. This was another resort in Florida that Morton ran for his father mostly, and then by him on his own after his father's death. This was called the Bellevue, and it currently is mostly demolished, but one part of the building was saved and recently reopened as a small boutique hotel, it was pretty spectacular. They invested a lot of money. In Connecticut, he built this resort. It was called the Griswold in Eastern Point in Groton. And if you know that area at all, it actually was right on the river and right across from what is now the plant of Pfizer. Pfizer actually owns this property now. The hotel operated long after Plant's death up through the 1960s. But this was, again, a place where it allowed the local people access to some amenities and some types of jobs that they would not have otherwise had. Plant employed physicians at the resort, nurses. He employed artists and musicians, chauffeurs, mechanics, and he housed a lot of them there. He also shared the crew between Connecticut and back and forth. Some of you may know this building. This is another of his contributions to Connecticut. It's called the Branford House. This was his summer mansion that he built at Avery Point in Groton. It's now located on the University of Connecticut Avery Point campus. All the gardens and fountains that you see in this picture are long gone, but the mansion remains and is a site of special events and some offices of the University of Connecticut. Actually, the campus director's office at the Branford House is in one of the plant family's former bedrooms. It's got to be the most spectacular office in Connecticut in terms of the view. It's just gorgeous. Plant also this little lighthouse was not there when Plant owned the estate, but the Pine Island, the small island out there that you see in the distance, he did own, and that has an interesting story too. There had been a manure plant on that island, and when Plant bought the Avery Point Peninsula for his summer house, he later decided to buy that island to get rid of the smell from the manure plant. So these are really good pictures. Another thing that Plant was able to do because of his wealth and also the way he operated was he brought in a lot of immigrants that worked on his properties. So, for example, they built Branford House, and he imported crews of Italian stonecutters to come in and build this property. There's not much evidence about how Plant directly related to them or what he felt about them, or even whether he interacted with them very much. But he certainly was instrumental in understanding that they had a talent and he needed that talent, and they had a brawn to do the work, and he specifically wanted Italian stonecutters. He also did have a respect for them that we know because he paid for property on which the community, the Italian community in Groton, which was one of the first large-scale groups of Italians in southeastern Connecticut, and the first Catholics, not first Catholics because there was a lot of Irish immigrants before that, but Plant bought the property that helped establish the first Catholic church in Groton. Before that, Catholics in Groton went to church in New London across the river. And so the Sacred Heart parish was Plant gave the money to establish that parish. And later, Electric Boat bought the property, and Sacred Heart moved to a different area of Groton. Another area that Plant had a lot of influence in was in agriculture, and this was something that influenced the whole state. So he wanted to go to Groton again because it had both the water, which he loved and he sailed on, but it also had a vast amount of undeveloped land, and he bought hundreds of acres of land in and around his estate on which he established model farms. He spent a tremendous amount of money to buy the livestock for those farms, going all over the country to purchase the best specimens of certain breeds of cows and sheep and pigs. And he ran a dairy farm there, and he had horses, he had chickens, he had a lot of exotic plants and fruits and vegetables. And the reason I have this picture of airplanes here which seems a little weird, is that a lot of his farm was on what is now public land. It's Groton New London Airport. And he also had an interest in promoting the area of conservation. That was something the state was very interested in. I should say, one of the reasons why many people in Connecticut were so interested in agriculture at this time was that it was a period where the number of farms was in steep decline. And especially in eastern Connecticut, a lot of old Yankee farms were being abandoned. So there was a lot of worry that Connecticut was losing its agricultural base. Conservation. So this again was an era where people were starting to realize that there was a consequence to not having many regulations about hunting or fishing or over clear-cutting land and that kind of thing. So Plant and some of his friends were very interested in helping to try to promote conservation efforts, and Plant bought what was about 3,000 acres of land in the town of East Lyme, Old Lyme, and Lyme, much of which is now the Stones Ranch Military Reservation and Camp Niantic. And that was where he had established a hunting lodge. He raised game birds there, and he raised some of his livestock out there. And he built roads and the trolley line to serve it. So this is an article, full-page article from the Hartford Courant in 1914 about his farms, where the journalist went to his farms and visited. This is Plant's hunting lodge, which still exists, but it's a private home. One of his biggest contributions, I think, was to Connecticut in general, was in the area of education. And I mentioned in my intro that he gave $1 million that helped establish Connecticut College. It actually was the instrumental donation that allowed the college to get up and operating. There had been a lot of support for the college. It came at a time when there was no more programs for women to earn a baccalaureate degree in Connecticut. Wesleyan had offered that to women earlier, but they stopped taking women for some reason that I'm not sure why. So there was a campaign to establish a 4-year college for women. Women could go to teachers' colleges, obviously. They could go to technical colleges like the Connecticut Agricultural College and earn a 2-year degree there, but the 4-year baccalaureate degree was not offered to women until the establishment of Connecticut College in New London. Morton Plant was the first president of the Board of Trustees, and they had gotten quite a bit of money. They had gotten land donated, but they really didn't have enough money to keep the college running. And so they would have these trustees meetings that went on and on and on. And Plant didn't have much patience for these long, drawn-out meetings in which they kept kind of droning on about where are we going to get this money. And one day, his baseball team, which was called the Planters, and they played in New London. Coincidentally, they played in the area where I now live, that neighborhood. And he knew that the Planters were playing that afternoon, and he wanted to go see them play. And he kept looking at the clock and getting anxious about being able to make the game. And finally he said, if I pledge $1 million, can we end the meeting and can we go on? And they said, yeah, okay, I think we'll do that. And so that pledge allowed them to actually open and operate. In addition to that $1 million, he also paid to build 2 of the original 3 buildings on the Connecticut College campus, which were named for in honor of his parents, Plant Hall and Blackstone Hall. And he gave money in his will, as did one of his later wives. And